They say your life flashes before your eyes in a moment of crisis. That's a lie. What actually flashes before you are the micro decisions. The red light you barely caught, the shoe you stopped to tie, the 3 seconds you spent choosing between a latte and a black coffee. Those seconds are the atoms of fate. My 3 seconds happened on a Tuesday night in November, on a stretch of Highway 26 that smelled of wet asphalt, old pine needles, and the oncoming rot of winter. I'm a salesman. My world is measured in miles per gallon and the artificial scent of new car hanging from my rearview mirror. I spend half my life in a silver sedan that has become a second skin. I was driving back from a disastrous meeting in Portland, a deal that fell through because of a typo in a contract. I was exhausted, my eyes burning from the rhythmic sweep of the wipers and the endless red and white streaks of the rainy interstate. I was exactly 3 miles from the nearest gas station when I saw her. It was 11:14 p.m. If I had pushed the gas just a little harder 5 miles back, I would have passed her before she even stepped out of her car. If I had stayed to argue with my boss for 3 seconds longer, she wouldn't have been there yet. But the universe has a cruel sense of clockwork. She was standing by a rusted-out station wagon on the shoulder. She wasn't waving or screaming. She was just standing there, her shoulders slumped, staring at the steam billowing from under her hood, with a look of such profound, quiet defeat that it bypassed my caution and went straight to my gut. I tapped the brakes. "Keep driving," my brain whispered. "It's late. It's raining. You don't know her." But I was raised by a man who believed that a person's character is defined by what they do when it's inconvenient. I pulled over, the gravel crunching under my tires like breaking bone. I rolled down the passenger window. The cold, wet air invaded the cabin, smelling of ozone. "Everything okay?" I called out. She walked toward the car. Up close, she looked older, perhaps in her late 50s. She wore a heavy, sensible wool coat that was already dark with rain. Her face was the kind you'd see 1,000 times in a supermarket and never remember. Gentle eyes, a slight tremor in her chin, a personification of vulnerability. "I am so incredibly sorry to bother you," she said, her voice shaking with a chill. "My radiator just went. My phone is completely dead, and my husband is at the hospital in Oak Haven. He went into emergency surgery an hour ago. I was trying to get to him." The story was perfect. It hit every emotional trigger I had. The hospital, the surgery, the dead phone. It turned me from a random driver into a hero in my own narrative. "Oak Haven is on my way," I said, leaning over to unlock the door. "Hop in. I can drop you right at the emergency entrance. It's no trouble at all." She sat down, bringing the smell of damp wool into my warm car. As she buckled her seatbelt, I noticed her hands. They were steady, not a single tremor despite the cold. And she wasn't carrying a purse, no bag, no wallet, just her coat. "Thank you, David," she said. The name hit me like a physical blow. I froze, my hand hovering over the gear shift. I hadn't introduced myself. "How do you know my name?" I asked, my voice suddenly tight. She didn't miss a beat. She pointed a pale finger at the dashboard where my company parking permit was tucked against the glass. "David Miller, Regional Sales." "Oh, right," I laughed, a sharp, nervous sound. "I forgot that was even there. For a second, I thought you were a mind reader." "Just observant," she said, her voice dropping a few degrees in pitch. "You have to be when you're waiting for someone." We pulled back onto the highway. The silence in the car was heavy, filled only by the thwack-thwack of the wipers. I tried to focus on the road, but I was acutely aware of her. She wasn't looking out the window at the passing trees. She was looking at the interior of my car. Her eyes roamed over the upholstery, the radio, the door locks, and finally, my face. "So, what kind of surgery is your husband having?" I asked, desperate to fill the silence. "The final kind," she replied. I frowned, glancing at her. I'm sorry? That sounds serious. It's a procedure where the person who goes in isn't the same as the person who comes out, if they come out at all. It's about balance, David, taking something away to pay for something else. I felt a cold prickle of unease. Her tone had changed. The frantic, stranded woman was gone. In her place sat someone cold, clinical, and terrifyingly calm. Do you believe in timing, David? She asked. People talk about fate as if it's a grand plan, but it's not. It's just math. It's about being at a specific set of coordinates at a specific millisecond. You were exactly on time tonight. I've been calculating your arrival for quite a while. Calculating? You mean you saw me coming? In a way, she said. I knew someone like you would come. Someone who thinks his 3 seconds of kindness can fix a broken world. You're the 300th silver sedan I've seen this month, but you were the only one with the right timing. I looked for the Oakhaven exit. It was a mile away. I wanted her out. I didn't care about her husband or her radiator anymore. I just wanted my car back. The hospital is just around this bend, I said, my voice forced. Could we stop at the gas station first? She asked. It wasn't a question. It was an instruction. The one on the corner of Miller Road. I need to buy a card, a get well card. They have a specific rack there. It's sentimental. The hospital gift shop will have plenty of cards, I said, my grip tightening on the steering wheel. No, it has to be that station. Please, David. For a man who stopped to help a stranger, surely you can spare another 3 minutes. The manipulation was blatant, but I was already under her spell. I pulled into the gas station, a modern, neon-lit island in the middle of the dark pines. It was empty. The clerk inside was a teenage boy with headphones on, oblivious to the world. I put the car in park. I'll wait here. Just be quick. She didn't move. She didn't reach for the door handle. She just sat there, staring through the windshield at the gas pumps. The cards are inside, I said, my frustration finally bubbling over. I know, I'm just waiting for the right moment. She looked at her bare wrist as if she were checking a watch. Tell me, David, who will miss you tomorrow morning? Who is waiting for you to walk through the door? I'm not married, if that's what you're asking. My parents live in Florida. Why does that matter? It matters because of the debt, she whispered. My husband, he didn't have surgery. He had an accident, a very expensive accident involving people who don't take insurance. They take collateral. They told me that if I could provide a replacement, a clean life to take his place in the ledger, they would let him come home. I laughed, but it was a dry, panicked sound. Is this a joke? Some kind of performance art? Get out of my car, lady. I reached for my door handle. It wouldn't budge. I pulled harder. I checked the lock. It was down, but when I tried to lift it, it snapped back as if held by an invisible hand. Child safety locks, she said, pulling a small, black device from her coat. It looked like a modified key fob. I've had yours synced for weeks. I spent 6 days in your office parking lot, David, just waiting within range of your signal. It's remarkably easy with the right hardware. My heart began to hammer a frantic rhythm against my ribs. This wasn't a random encounter. My 3 seconds weren't a choice. They were the final piece of a trap that had been set long before I left Portland. Why me? I gasped. I'm just a salesman. I'm nobody. That's exactly why, she said. No wife, no kids, a predictable route, a silver sedan that looks like a million others. You are the perfect phantom, David. You are the man who disappears into the rain and leaves no ripples. She pointed to the gas station window. A man in a dark suit stepped out from the shadows near the car wash. He was holding a phone, looking directly at us. He began to walk toward the car, his footsteps silent on the wet pavement. You think you made a choice to stop, she said, her face inches from mine. But your choice was made years ago when you decided to be a good man. That was your first error. The second was stopping. The third was looking at me and seeing a victim. She reached into her coat. I tried to lunge for her, to grab her throat, but the seatbelt was a straitjacket. She was surprisingly strong, her movements precise and practiced. She pulled out a syringe. "Don't fight it, David. If you fight, it hurts. If you let go, it's just like falling asleep in your car after a long shift. 3 seconds of darkness and then nothing." I screamed for the boy in the gas station, but the windows were rolled up, the rain was drumming on the roof, and he never even looked up from his phone. The man in the suit reached the car. He pulled the key from his pocket, an identical silver key, and unlocked the driver's side door. The cold air rushed in. The man grabbed my hair, pulling my head back against the headrest. Prick. The needle went into my neck. I felt a cold, oily sensation spreading through my veins, a chemical tide that turned my limbs to lead. "You're a good man, David," the woman said, her voice becoming a distant echo. A good man who arrived at exactly the wrong time. As my vision began to fracture into shards of green and black, I watched her move. She climbed over the center console, pushing my limp body into the passenger seat as the man in the suit climbed into the back. She adjusted the rearview mirror. She checked her teeth in the glass. She looked like a woman who had just finished a long day of shopping. She put the car in gear. The silver sedan pulled out of the gas station, turning away from Oakhaven, away from my life, and into the endless dark of the forest. I woke up in a room with no windows. There are 4 others here. We don't talk. There is nothing to say. We all have the same story. A car on the shoulder, a rainy night, a moment of kindness. I spend my time counting. I count the seconds. 1, 2, 3. Somewhere out there, she is standing by a rusted station wagon. The steam is rising from the hood. She is waiting for the next silver sedan. She is waiting for you to check your clock, to tap your brakes, and to give her the 3 seconds she needs to replace the next person in the room. And the worst part? When you see her, you will stop. Because you're a good person, and in this world, that is the only mistake you can never take back. The cabin at the edge of the Bitterroot Wilderness had no name, no address, and, until 3 weeks ago, no ghosts of the past. Silas had bought it with cash, a transaction made in a dim bar with a man who didn't care why a city lawyer wanted to disappear into the harshest terrain in Montana. Silas wanted a place where the air didn't taste of exhaust and the silence wasn't interrupted by the relentless ping of notifications. He wanted a hard life, one measured in cords of wood and gallons of well water. For the first month, the isolation was a balm. His days were a rhythmic cycle of physical labor that left his muscles aching and his mind blissfully empty. He learned the specific groan of the cabin's timber during a frost, the way the wind whistled through the gaps in the stone chimney, and the heavy, muffled stillness that preceded a heavy snowfall. He was alone, and he was content. Until the Tuesday he found the red scarf. It was caught on a low-hanging branch of a hemlock tree 50 yards from his front porch. It was bright, expensive cashmere, a startling splash of crimson against the monochromatic gray of the winter woods. Silas stared at it for a long time. There were no hiking trails within 20 miles, and the nearest neighbor was a day's trek through waist-deep snow. He left it there, convincing himself it was a remnant from a previous owner, unearthed by the recent thaw. But that night, the silence of the woods felt different. It wasn't a peaceful absence of noise anymore. It was an expectant hush, as if the forest were leaning in to see what he would do next. The next morning, the scarf was on his porch. It was neatly folded and placed on the wooden bench beside his door. Silas didn't go for his rifle. He went for his axe, his knuckles white as he gripped the handle. He scanned the tree line, but the woods were a wall of unmoving pine. There were no tracks in the snow, no boot prints, no disturbances in the white crust that covered the clearing. The air was perfectly still. "Who's out there?" he shouted. His voice felt thin, swallowed by the vastness of the mountains. There was no answer, only the distant, mocking cry of a gray jay. He brought the scarf inside and threw it into the wood stove. He watched the expensive fabric blacken and curl, the smell of burnt wool filling the cabin. He told himself it was a prank, a local hunter messing with the city boy. But as the sun began to dip below the jagged peaks, he found himself checking the locks on the heavy oak door, locks he had never bothered to use before. 3 days passed in a blur of paranoia. Silas stopped venturing into the woods. He kept his eyes on the clearing, his rifle leaning against the kitchen table. He was a man of logic, and logic told him that someone was watching him, someone who knew the terrain better than he did, someone who could move through the snow without leaving a trace. On the 4th night, he woke up to the smell of wood smoke. It wasn't the smell of his own stove. This was different, the acrid, sharp scent of an open campfire. He rolled out of bed, grabbing his rifle. He crept to the window and looked out. In the center of the clearing, a fire was burning. It was small, a controlled flicker of orange light in the darkness. Sitting beside it was a man. He was wearing a heavy, tattered coat and a wide-brimmed hat that obscured his face. He was perfectly still, his hands held out toward the flames. Silas felt a surge of adrenaline that made his vision sharpen. He stepped onto the porch, the cold air biting at his bare skin. "Get off my property!" Silas yelled, leveling the rifle. The man didn't flinch. He didn't even turn around. He simply reached into his pocket and pulled something out. He held it up so the firelight caught it. It was a photograph. Silas stepped off the porch, his boots crunching in the snow. He kept the rifle trained on the man's back as he approached the fire. When he was 10 feet away, he could see the photo clearly. It was a picture of Silas, taken through the window of the cabin while he was sleeping. "What do you want?" Silas's voice was a whisper now, his throat tight with a terror he had never known. The man finally turned his head. His face was a map of scars and deep-set wrinkles, his eyes a pale, milky blue. He smiled, revealing yellowed teeth. "I don't want anything, Silas," the man said. His voice was a raspy growl, the sound of a throat that hadn't been used for years. "I just wanted to see if you were the one the house was waiting for." "I bought this place. It's mine," Silas snapped, though his hands were shaking. "You bought the wood and the stone," the man said, standing up slowly. He was taller than Silas, his frame gaunt but powerful. "But you can't buy the history. The man who lived here before you, he didn't leave because he wanted to. He left because he couldn't handle the weight."
"The weight of what?" "The silence," the man said, stepping toward him. "It gets inside you, Silas. It starts to fill up the parts of your brain that remember how to be a person. You start to think the trees are talking. You start to think the wind is calling your name. And then, one day, you realize that you aren't Silas anymore. You're just another piece of the woods." The man reached out a hand, but Silas backed away, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Go," Silas hissed. "Now, or I swear to God." The man laughed, a dry, hacking sound. "I'm already gone, Silas. I've been gone for a long time." He turned and walked into the darkness. Silas watched him until the orange glow of the fire died down, leaving only smoldering embers. He didn't sleep that night. He sat in the chair by the window, watching the tree line until the sun rose. When the light finally touched the clearing, the fire pit was gone. Not just the fire, the pit itself. The snow was unbroken. There were no charred logs, no ash, no footprints. Silas ran to the spot where the man had been sitting. He dug into the snow with his bare hands, looking for any sign of the encounter.
Nothing. Only the cold, white earth. He ran back to the cabin, desperate to find the photograph the man had held. He searched the porch, the bench, the kitchen. He found it on his pillow. It wasn't the photo he had seen last night. It was a new one. It showed Silas standing in the clearing, holding a rifle, looking at an empty fire pit. But in the background of the photo, standing in the doorway of the cabin, was the man in the tattered coat. Silas realized then that the man wasn't a ghost. He was a squatter, a hermit who had been living in the crawl space beneath the cabin for months. He was a master of the terrain, a man who knew how to move through the woods without leaving a trail. He wasn't supernatural. He was just a human who had gone feral, a man who had become a predator. Silas grabbed his car keys and a handful of supplies. He didn't care about the cabin or the money he had spent. He just wanted out. He ran to his truck, parked a mile down the trail, and gunned the engine. As he drove down the winding mountain road, he looked in the rearview mirror. Sitting in the back seat was the red scarf, neatly folded. He didn't stop. He drove until he reached the highway, then he kept driving until he reached the city. He sold the cabin a month later, taking a massive loss. He never went back to Montana. He moved into a high-rise apartment in the center of the city, where the noise of the traffic was a constant, comforting roar. But sometimes, when the apartment is very quiet at 3 a.m, Silas hears a sound. It's not a ghost. It's the sound of someone moving beneath the floorboards, a soft, rhythmic scraping. And when he wakes up in the morning, he finds his shoes have been moved. The silence had followed him home. Because once the silence gets inside you, it never really leaves. It just waits for the next time you're alone.
My name is Sarah, and I used to love my digital footprint. I was a lifestyle influencer on the rise, sharing my morning lattes, my jogging routes through Seattle, and the view from my floor-to-ceiling windows. I thought I was building a brand. I didn't realize I was building a roadmap for a predator. It started with a superfan named Watcher77. At first, it was just likes, every photo within seconds of posting. Then came the comments. They weren't creepy, just overly observant. "That new rug looks softer than the gray one you had in 2022, he'd post. I brushed it off. I had 50,000 followers, some were bound to be intense. The first red flag appeared 3 months ago. I posted a photo of a bouquet of lilies I'd bought myself. 10 minutes later, I got a DM from Watcher77. "Lilies are beautiful, but they're toxic to cats. Make sure Luna stays away from the vase." I felt a chill. I had never mentioned my cat's name on my new account. I had moved to a new apartment and started fresh. How did he know about Luna? I checked my old, archived posts from 4 years ago. Hidden in the background of one blurry photo was a bowl with Luna written on it in tiny letters. He had gone back years. He had studied every pixel. I blocked him. Blocking him was a mistake. It signaled that I had noticed him. It gave him the reaction he wanted. A week later, I was walking home from my favorite gym. It's a small boutique place with no signage tucked into a side street. As I reached my doorstep, my phone buzzed. An AirTag notification. "An unknown accessory has been traveling with you for some time." I emptied my gym bag on the sidewalk. I ripped open the lining, checked my shoes, my water bottle. Nothing. Then, I felt a small lump in the hem of my expensive yoga leggings. I sliced the fabric open with my house key. A small, silver AirTag fell onto the concrete. On the back, written in permanent marker, was a small 77. My hands shook so hard I couldn't get the key into the lock. He hadn't just found my gym. He had been close enough to me to slip a tracker into my clothes while I was in the shower. I went to the police. They were sympathetic but useless.
Unless he threatens you or shows up at your door, there isn't much we can do, Sarah. Change your settings. Get a dog." I did more than that. I went dark. I deleted Instagram. I stayed with a friend for 2 weeks. When I finally returned home, I felt like I was being watched by my own walls. That's when the glitches started. My smart TV would turn on in the middle of the night, showing a static screen. My laptop camera's blue light would flicker for a split second. I covered every lens with black tape, but the feeling persisted. One night, I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard a sound from my living room. Click, click, click. It was the sound of a camera shutter. I grabbed a kitchen knife and crept into the hallway. The room was empty, but when I looked at my desktop computer, the monitor was glowing. I hadn't turned it on. Someone was remotely accessing my files. I watched as the cursor moved on its own. It opened a folder labeled Private. The cursor hovered over a photo of me sleeping in my bed, taken from an angle that shouldn't be possible. The camera wasn't on the computer. It wasn't on the phone. I looked up. Directly above my bed was a small, decorative vent. Hidden inside the grate was a pinhole lens wired directly into my home's Ethernet port. He wasn't just hacking my devices, he had been inside my apartment to install hardware. I didn't call the police this time. I knew he was watching the cameras. If I called for help, he'd vanish again. I needed to catch him. I pretended to go to bed. I lay under the covers, clutching my phone and a canister of pepper spray. Outside, a massive rainstorm was battering Seattle, the thunder masking the sounds of the city. At 2:14 a.m., the heavy oak door to my bedroom creaked open. I didn't breathe. I kept my eyes shut, my heart drumming against my ribs. I heard the wet squelch of a rain-soaked boot on my hardwood floor. He didn't go for my throat. He didn't go for my jewelry. He walked to the side of my bed and sat down. I could smell him, the scent of damp wool and something metallic, like copper. "I know you're awake, Sarah," he whispered. The voice was thin, reedy, like a broken instrument. "The tape on the cameras was a nice touch, but I don't need to see you through a lens anymore." I lunged. I sprayed the pepper spray directly where I thought his face was and rolled off the other side of the bed. He screamed, a high-pitched, inhuman sound, and began thrashing in the dark. I ran for the front door, but it was deadbolted from the inside with a key I didn't have. He had replaced my locks. I scrambled into the kitchen, the only room with a fire escape. I climbed out into the freezing rain, my pajamas soaked in seconds. I didn't look back until I reached the street. The police caught him 2 hours later, hiding in the basement of my building. His name was Arthur Vance, a 42-year-old former IT contractor for the building's management company. When they searched his apartment, they found what they called the Sarah Room. He had printed every single photo I had ever posted, over 3,000 of them, and wallpapered his entire bedroom with them. He had a life-sized mannequin dressed in clothes he had stolen from my laundry. But the most terrifying part was the Diary of Sarah. He had recorded every time I brushed my teeth, every time I cried, every time I talked to my mother on the phone. He knew my favorite brand of toothpaste. He knew I was afraid of the dark. He had been living in the crawl space behind my closet for weeks. Arthur is in prison now, but the story doesn't end there. Last week, a year after the trial, I moved to a new city under a different name. I don't post photos anymore. I don't even have a smartphone. I was sitting in a small cafe, enjoying the anonymity, when a stranger walked up to me and handed me a small, folded piece of paper. "A guy outside told me to give this to you," the stranger said. I opened the paper. It was a printout of a photo taken 5 minutes ago. It was a shot of me sitting in the cafe looking at the window. On the back, written in familiar, jagged handwriting, were 3 words. "Nice new rug." I looked at the floor of the cafe. It was a bright red rug I hadn't even noticed. He wasn't Watcher 77. He was a part of a community, an online forum where men like him trade access to women's lives. Arthur was gone, but his success had been shared. I wasn't being stalked by a man anymore. I was being stalked by a network. Now, I don't look for one person. I look at everyone, because any one of them could be the next person waiting for their turn to watch. The last thing I remember of a normal life was the taste of a chicken sandwich and the sight of white clouds outside the window of Lanza Flight 508. It was Christmas Eve, 1971. I was 17 years old, sitting next to my mother, Maria. We were flying from Lima to Pucallpa to meet my father for the holidays. The air turned violent without warning. One moment the cabin was filled with the soft chatter of passengers and the crinkle of gift wrap. The next, we were a toy in the hands of a titan. The Lockheed Electra began to shudder, not the usual vibration of turbulence, but a deep, structural groan. Outside, the sky turned pitch black, illuminated only by jagged streaks of lightning that seemed to dance on the wings. "This is the end," my mother said. Her voice was calm, a stark contrast to the screaming passengers around us. Those were the last words I ever heard her speak. A blinding flash hit the right wing. The engine exploded. For a split second, the plane felt like it was suspended in time. Then, the world tore apart. The fuselage snapped like a dry twig. The roar of the engines was replaced by the deafening whistle of the wind as I was sucked out into the void. I was still strapped to my seat, row 19F. I was falling, spinning through the air like a sycamore seed. I remember the sensation of the cold air rushing past me, the dizzying sight of the green canopy rushing up from below, and then silence. I woke up on Christmas Day. The first thing I felt was the silence. No engines, no screams, just the rhythmic drip of rain on broad leaves and the distant call of a bird. I was on the ground, still strapped into the 3-seat bench. It had acted as a parachute, or perhaps the dense foliage had cushioned the final impact. My body was a map of pain. My collarbone was snapped. I had a deep gash on my right arm and a concussion that made the world tilt. My right eye was swollen shut. But I was alive. "Mommy!" I cried out. My voice was a rasp. "Mommy!" Only the jungle answered. I crawled out from under the seats, searching the immediate area. I found a small bag of candy, panettone, and some sweets. That was my only food. I looked for survivors, for wreckage, for anything. There was nothing but green shadows. My parents were zoologists. I grew up in the Amazon at their research station, Penguana. My father had taught me the first rule of the jungle. If you are lost, find water. Follow the stream to the creek to the river. Where there is a river, there are people. I found a small spring trickling over stones. I began to follow it. My sandals had been lost in the fall, leaving me with only one shoe. Every step was agony. The floor of the jungle is a carpet of roots, thorns, and rotting vegetation. The heat was stifling, a wet blanket that never lifted. My wounds began to fester. The gash on my arm became infested with blowfly maggots. I watched them burrowing under my skin, eating me alive. I knew I couldn't stop to rest for too long. If I stopped, I would die. I moved like a ghost through the trees. I saw king vultures circling high above. I knew why they were there. They had found the others. I had to keep moving so they wouldn't find me. By the 4th day, the small spring had become a stream. The water was waist-deep in places. I swam when I could to save my strength, letting the current carry me. I was terrified of caimans and piranhas, but I remembered my father's words. The water is safer than the shore. On the shore, there are jaguars and snakes. In the water, you are just another piece of driftwood. Hunger became a dull ache, replaced by a crystalline focus born of desperation. I ran out of candy on the third day. Now I drank only the murky water of the river. The jungle began to play tricks on me. I heard the sound of plane engines in every buzz of a cicada. I saw the white fuselage of the aircraft in every flash of a tropical flower. I talked to myself to stay sane, reciting poems I had learned in school or explaining the classification of the plants I passed, as my father would have done. My maggots were getting bigger. They were the size of my fingernail now, pulsing under my skin. The pain was rhythmic, a stabbing sensation every few seconds. I was becoming part of the jungle, a decaying organism being reclaimed by the earth. On the 8th day, the stream joined a large river, the Shabonya. It was wide and slow. I floated in the middle, my head barely above water. I was so thin that my ribs pushed against my skin like the hull of a wrecked ship. I saw a large caiman on the bank, watching me with golden eyes. I didn't feel fear. I felt a strange kinship. We were both just trying to survive the day.
I was drifting toward death when I saw it. A glint of something that didn't belong in nature. A straight line. I pulled myself onto the muddy bank, my limbs feeling like lead. It was a boat, a small wooden dugout canoe moored to the shore. I thought I was dreaming. I crawled toward it, reaching out to touch the rough wood. It was real. Nearby, I saw a small path leading to a hut. It was a shelter used by lumbermen. It was empty, but it had a roof of palm leaves and a floor of pounded earth. Most importantly, I found a can of gasoline. I remembered what my father did to the cattle at the station when they had maggots. I opened the can and poured the gasoline directly into the wound on my arm. The pain was an explosion. It felt like my arm was being cauterized by a lightning bolt. I screamed until I lost my voice. But as the gasoline burned, dozens of maggots began to crawl out of my flesh. I picked them out, one by one, 30 of them, until the wound was clean. I collapsed on the floor of the hut and slept for the first time without the fear of being eaten. I woke to the sound of voices, not the voices of my hallucinations, but the rough, rhythmic speech of men. 3 Peruvian lumbermen found me. When they first saw me, a skeletal girl with one shoe covered in blood and gasoline emerging from the shadows, they thought I was a Yara, a water spirit from their legends. They almost fled in terror. "Please," I whispered in Spanish, "I am a girl from the Lanza crash." They were kind. They washed me, fed me salt and bread, and treated my wounds. The next day, they took me on an 11-hour boat journey down the river to a small village. From there, a bush pilot flew me to a hospital where I finally saw my father. He was a broken man, but when he saw me, he wept. Out of 92 people on that flight, I was the only one who came back. They found the wreckage a few days later. They found my mother. She had survived the fall too, but she was badly injured and couldn't move. She had lived for several days in the jungle, waiting for help that never came, while her daughter was miles away fighting her way to the river. That realization is a shadow that has followed me for 50 years. I didn't become a victim. I became a biologist, like my parents. I returned to the Amazon many times. People call me the girl who fell from the sky, but I don't feel like a miracle. I feel like a part of the forest. The jungle tried to take me, then it tried to break me, and finally, it taught me how to live. I still fly, but whenever the plane hits turbulence and the cabin begins to shake, I close my eyes and feel the wind. I remember the sensation of falling, and I remind myself that even when the world breaks apart, there is always a river. And as long as you follow the water, you can find your way home. Always check the pin, my girlfriend told me every single time I grabbed my car keys and headed out for the night shift.
Make sure the name matches. There are creeps out there, Leo. People who think ride-sharing is just a hunting ground for the bored and the broken. I always laughed it off. I'm a big guy, 6'2", 200 pounds, and I keep a heavy, aircraft-grade aluminum flashlight under my seat that can do more damage than a baseball bat. I had 3 high-definition cameras installed in the cabin. I thought I was bulletproof. I thought nothing could surprise me anymore. That was before I took a ride on a Tuesday night in a forgotten corner of New Jersey, where the roads end in salt marshes and the trees look like twisted skeletons reaching for the sky. I was finishing a grueling 12-hour shift. My brain was in a fog, my eyes were burning from staring at brake lights, and the only thing I wanted was a strong coffee and my bed. Then the phone chimed. One last ride. Rider, Sarah. Pickup, 112 Blackwood Lane. It was a dead-end street bordering a nature preserve, a place where the woods are thick and the cell signal is a luxury. I pulled up to the house. It was an old Victorian, swallowed by ivy that looked like it was trying to strangle the structure. No lights were on in the windows, they were just black voids reflecting my headlights. A woman walked out from the porch shadows. She looked exactly like her profile picture. Blonde hair, mid-20s, wearing a striking, bright red wool coat. She got into the back seat, closed the door with a soft thud, and smiled politely. "Sarah?" I asked, performing the routine check. "Yes, for the airport, please. I'm running a bit late," she said in a sweet, melodic voice. I started the trip. The app calculated a 40-minute drive. For the first 10 minutes, everything was perfectly normal. We chatted about the weather, how hard it was to get a ride out this far, and her supposed flight to London. She seemed educated, kind, almost too perfect. Then the world broke. My phone, mounted on the dashboard, chimed. A notification appeared directly from the Uber app. Message from Sarah, rider. "I am so sorry, but I'm going to be about 10 minutes late. Are you still at the house? I hope you can wait for me." I felt a drop of ice-cold sweat slide down my spine. I looked in the rearview mirror. The woman in the red coat was still there. She was staring out the window at the dark trees rushing by. In the reflection of the mirror, our eyes met for a fraction of a second. "Is everything okay, Leo?" she asked. Her voice was still sweet, but her eyes, they were different now. There were no pupils, no irises, just a solid, flat, glossy blue that looked like cheap glass beads. I just got a weird notification from the app," I stammered. My heart was racing so hard I could feel it in my throat. I slowed down and pulled over to the gravel shoulder in a stretch where there were no streetlights for miles. "I need to restart the GPS." I looked at the message again. It was real. It was sent from the account that was currently active in my car. I looked back at the woman. She was sitting perfectly still. Her hands were folded in her lap, her fingers interlaced with a precision that looked mechanical. "Who are you?" I whispered, my hand slowly creeping under my seat for the flashlight. The woman didn't answer. Instead, her smile began to widen. It wasn't a human movement. The corners of her mouth stretched further and further toward her ears until the skin on her cheeks turned a translucent, sickly white. Then her jaw began to fail. It dropped lower and lower, stretching the skin of her face into an impossible oval. A sound began to leak out of her throat. It wasn't a scream. It was my own voice, played back like a distorted, slowed-down recording of the conversation we had 5 minutes ago. "Always check the pin, Leo. Creeps out there. Make sure the name matches." I didn't think. I kicked the driver's side door open and practically fell out of the car. I didn't wait to see what she would do. I ran into the darkness, my lungs burning, and I didn't look back once. I ran until I found a highway patrol car parked 2 miles down the road. When the police found my car an hour later, it was empty. The engine was still idling, the driver's door was wide open, but there was no sign of a woman in a red coat. However, on the back seat, they found a blonde wig and the red coat, neatly folded as if it had never been worn. Inside the pocket of the coat was a small, high-tech digital recording device and a folded paper map. On that map, my own home address was circled in thick, red ink. The real terror came the next day when the police reviewed the footage from my own dashcam and the security camera from the house on Blackwood Lane. The video from the house showed me pulling up. It showed the empty porch. It showed me sitting there for 2 minutes, talking to absolute empty air. Then, on the video, the rear door of my car opened by itself. The chassis dipped slightly as if someone had stepped inside, and the door slammed shut. But there was no one there. The interior cabin camera was even worse. For 10 minutes of driving, the footage showed me talking to an empty back seat. But the audio captured her voice, a female voice answering my questions, clear as a bell. At the moment I pulled over to the shoulder, the camera showed the rear seatbelt suddenly snapping tight and vibrating, as if it were strangling an invisible torso. The app registered the trip as completed, even though I had fled. The real Sarah was found a week later in that house on Blackwood Lane. She was in a hidden cellar, bound and gagged, but alive. She told the police that whoever stole her phone didn't want her money. They wanted her identity for a specific window of time. I never drove again. I sold the car and moved to a high-rise apartment with 24-hour security. But sometimes, when I'm lying in bed and the room is perfectly silent, I hear a faint, digitally distorted sound coming from the dark corner of the room. Always check the pin, Leo. My name is Mark. I've been driving for rideshare apps in Chicago for over 3 years. It started as a way to pay off student loans, but it became a habit. I know the city's veins like the back of my hand, the glittering lights of the Magnificent Mile, the crumbling brick of the South Side, and the desolate industrial zones where the river smells of iron and old secrets. You see a lot of strange things at 3 a.m. I've driven sobbing brides, sleeping CEOs, and people who talk to themselves as if they're arguing with a ghost. But I never had a ride that made me want to burn my car until last October. The ping came at exactly 2:44 a.m. I was sitting in a gas station parking lot, the neon light humming above me. The rider's name was just H, no photo, a perfect 5.0 rating. The pickup was located in a stretch of the industrial district that even the streetlights seemed to avoid. Usually, I'd decline a ride like that, but the surge pricing was astronomical. It was a 5 times multiplier. My greed outweighed my instinct. When I pulled up to the coordinates, I was surrounded by windowless warehouses and rusted chain-link fences. A single man was waiting under a flickering streetlight that buzzed like a dying insect. He was tall, impossibly thin, wearing a heavy trench coat that seemed to swallow the light around it. A wide-brimmed hat was pulled low, casting his entire face into a void of shadow. He didn't wait for me to unlock the doors. He didn't even check the license plate. He just reached out, opened the back left door, and slid in with a movement so fluid it didn't seem human. "Heading the Graceland Cemetery?" I asked, my voice sounding thin. I tried to make eye contact in the rearview mirror, but all I saw was the darkness under his hat. The destination was a specific maintenance gate at the very edge of the historic graveyard. "Yes," he whispered. His voice didn't sound like it came from a throat. It sounded like dry leaves being crushed under a heavy boot. "But we need to pick up the others first. They've been waiting a long time." I checked my app, confused. "Sir, this wasn't requested as a shared ride. The booking is just for one person. If you want to add stops, you have to do it through the app." The man didn't move. He didn't even tilt his head. "The app doesn't know everything, Mark," he said. The way he said my name sent a cold spike through my heart. "Stop at the next corner, under the bridge. The shadows there are deep enough for them to climb out." I felt a surge of adrenaline, the fight-or-flight response, but my muscles felt heavy, as if the air in the car had turned into cold syrup. I drove to the bridge. The darkness beneath the overpass was absolute. I slowed to a crawl and stopped. Suddenly, the back right door clicked open. I stared into the darkness of the bridge, expecting to see a person, but there was only empty air. Then, the car dipped. The rear suspension groaned under a massive, invisible weight. I felt the seat next to the man in the hat sink down, the fabric stretching as if someone weighing 200 pounds had just sat there. The door latched shut with a heavy thud. "One more," the man in the hat said. "The tenement on 4th Street. He's tired of waiting in the cold." I was trembling so hard my foot kept slipping off the brake. I drove to the next stop, a boarded-up brick building that had been slated for demolition for years. Again, I stopped. Again, a door opened into the void. This time, the car sank even lower. The engine began to struggle, the RPMs jumping as if I were hauling a trailer full of lead. The interior of the car turned freezing. My breath began to mist in the air, and frost started to bloom on the inside of the windows in jagged, fern-like patterns. "Sir, please," I stammered, looking in the mirror. "There's no one else here. Why is the car so heavy? Why is it so cold?" In the mirror, the back seat was empty except for the man in the hat. But when I looked over my shoulder, my eyes widened in horror. The seat covers were deeply depressed. 3 distinct imprints of human bodies were sunk into the foam. I could see the shape of shoulders, the weight of heads, but there was nothing but shimmering, cold air. "Don't look back, Mark," the man whispered. And this time I felt a hand, a cold, damp, invisible hand, brush against the back of my neck. "They don't like to be looked at. They're shy. They've spent decades under that bridge and in those walls. They just want to go home now." I turned back to the road, staring straight ahead as if my life depended on it. I tried to reach for my phone to cancel the ride, but the screen was a mess of gray static. A low, rhythmic humming began to vibrate through the car's speakers, not music, but a sound like a funeral choir recorded underwater and played at half speed. As we reached the iron gates of Graceland Cemetery, the car felt like it was dragging a mountain. The tires were screaming against the asphalt, smoking from the friction. I pulled up to the maintenance gate. "Stop here," the man commanded. I slammed the car into park. Both back doors flew open simultaneously. I felt 3 distinct rushes of ice-cold air pass by my head, heavy, foul-smelling air that smelled of wet earth and ancient dust. Outside, the grass of the cemetery began to frost over in the shape of footsteps leading away from the car, moving deeper into the rows of tombstones. The man in the hat remained. He leaned forward, his face still a black hole, but I could finally see his hands. They were pale, elongated things with too many joints, 4 knuckles on each finger. "You did well, Mark," he whispered. "Most drivers look back, and once you look at them, they realize you can see them. And once they know you can see them, they never want to leave your car. They follow you home. They sit on your chest while you sleep." He reached into the folds of his trench coat and placed a single coin on the center console. It was a heavy, ancient-looking piece of silver. Then he stepped out, and the fog swallowed him before he even hit the ground. Suddenly, my phone buzzed. A notification appeared. "Ride canceled. Rider did not show." The car's suspension snapped back up so violently the whole frame shook. The heater suddenly roared to life, blasting hot air. I looked at the silver coin. It was a Greek drachma, freezing to the touch. When I looked at the back seat, the fabric was scorched black where the invisible passengers had sat. 3 perfect, charred outlines of human figures burned into the upholstery. I quit driving that night. I sold the car to a scrapyard for $500 just to get it out of my sight. But sometimes, when I'm taking a bus or sitting in the back of a taxi, I feel the seat next to me dip. I feel a sudden, localized chill in the air. And I never, ever look back. Because I know that somewhere in this city, there are things waiting for a ride. and they are always looking for someone who can see them.
I've always loved driving. For me, it was a form of meditation. No boss breathing down my neck, just the rhythmic hum of the tires and the yellow lines of the road flickering past like a film strip. I usually took the long-distance trips, people traveling from the neon-soaked chaos of the city to the quiet, forgotten mountain towns upstate. It was peaceful. Or at least, it was until I met Thomas on a foggy Tuesday night in November. I picked him up near an old library. Thomas was a quiet, academic-looking man in his 60s, wearing a tweed jacket that smelled of old paper and cedar. He was traveling to a cabin about 3 hours away, deep in a part of the woods where GPS signals go to die. "I appreciate you taking the trip, James," he said as he buckled his seatbelt. "Most drivers cancel when they see how far out it goes. They don't like the darkness of Route 9. "I don't mind the dark, Thomas," I replied, shifting into gear. "It's the traffic I can't stand." We were about 90 minutes into the drive, navigating the twisting, narrow bends of Route 9. The fog was thick, hugging the trees like a wet shroud. We hadn't seen another car in nearly an hour. The only light came from my high beams, which cut through the mist to reveal the endless, repetitive wall of pines. That was when Thomas asked the question that changed everything. "Do you ever feel like you're driving in a loop, James?" I chuckled, thinking he was just tired. "Every night, Thomas. On these long hauls, the trees start to look like the same 3 props from a low-budget movie." "No," Thomas said, his voice flat and devoid of humor. "I mean a real loop. Look at the sign we just passed. What did it say?" I glanced at the side of the road. It was an old, faded sign for a diner called the Rusty Spoon. "Just a diner. We passed one about 15 minutes ago. Probably a local chain." "There are no chains on Route 9, James," Thomas whispered. "Wait for it." Exactly 10 minutes later, the sign appeared again. The Rusty Spoon. Same flickering neon S in the word spoon. Same rusted red pickup truck parked in the gravel lot. Same cracked window in the front. My stomach did a slow, nauseating roll. "Coincidence," I muttered, though I didn't believe it. I checked the GPS. The blue dot was moving forward steadily along the line. According to the map, we were miles past the first diner. 10 minutes later, it appeared a third time. The Rusty Spoon. I slammed on the brakes. The car skidded on the wet asphalt, coming to a halt right in front of the neon sign. I stared at the red truck. I knew that truck. I had noticed a dent in the rear bumper the first time we passed it. The dent was still there. "Thomas, what the hell is this? Did I turn around? Is the GPS broken?" Thomas didn't look at me. He was staring at the digital clock on my dashboard. It showed 3:14 a.m. I waited for a minute. The numbers didn't change. I waited for another minute. Still 3:14 a.m. "We're in the routine now, James," Thomas said, and for the first time, I noticed how pale his skin was. It looked like the color of unbaked dough. "The road has caught us. It doesn't want the car to stop. It needs the engine to keep humming. It needs the lights to keep cutting the dark, or the woods will move in." "I'm turning around," I said, my voice cracking. I grabbed the steering wheel to pull a U-turn, but the wheel wouldn't budge. It was locked in place, pointed straight ahead. I tried to shift into reverse, but the gear stick was frozen. The car began to move forward on its own. I took my feet off the pedals. The car maintained a perfect, steady 50 miles per hour. The engine sound began to change. It grew deeper, more organic, a rhythmic, wet thump-thump that felt less like pistons and more like a massive, mechanical heart beating under the hood. "I've been in this car for a very long time, James," Thomas whispered. He turned to look at me, and I suppressed a scream. His skin was no longer just pale, it was becoming textured.
His forearm, resting on the center console, was turning into the same gray, pebbled plastic as the car's interior. His tweed jacket was fusing with the fabric of the seat.
"I was the driver once," he continued, his voice sounding like it was coming from the car's speakers instead of his mouth. "But the routine needs a driver, and it needs a passenger. It needs the cycle to stay complete. I'm tired, James. I've driven this loop for decades. I'm ready to sit in the back." "Get out of my car!" I yelled, reaching across him to pull the passenger door handle. It snapped off in my hand like it was made of dry wax. "You don't understand," Thomas said, his eyes now two flat, black circles. "The road doesn't let you leave. It just lets you change seats. Someone has to keep the lights on. Someone has to keep the wheels turning. Eventually, someone will pick you up." The car was approaching the Rusty Spoon for the 10th time. I looked at the dashboard. My own hands were starting to turn a dull, plastic gray. I could feel the steering wheel merging with my palms, the nerves in my fingers connecting to the wiring of the column. In a moment of pure, blind terror, I threw my weight against the driver's side door. It didn't open, so I used my shoulder to shatter the window. The glass didn't break into shards. It crumbled like sugar. I dived out of the moving car, tumbling onto the hard, cold asphalt. I rolled down an embankment, thorns tearing at my skin, mud filling my mouth. I crashed through the brush until I hit a tree and everything went black. When I woke up, the sun was rising. The fog was gone. I climbed back up to the road. Route 9 was empty. No diner, no red truck, just a quiet, ordinary highway. I started walking. After 3 miles, I saw a car approaching from the distance. It was a silver sedan. My silver sedan. I dove into the bushes as it drove past. I looked through the windows. I saw myself in the driver's seat. My face was expressionless, my hands fused to the wheel, eyes locked on the road. And in the back seat, Thomas was sitting comfortably, looking out the window with a peaceful smile. But as the car passed, I saw a third figure. In the front passenger seat, there was a woman. She looked like a hiker I had seen at the gas station earlier that night. She was looking at the dashboard clock with a confused expression. The car disappeared into the distance, the engine making that rhythmic, organic thump, thump sound. I never went back for my car. I told the police it was stolen, but I think they knew I was lying by the look in my eyes. I live in the city now, where I can walk everywhere. I never get into a car. But sometimes, when it's late and the city noise dies down, I hear it. A distant, steady, 50-mile-per-hour hum. And I know that somewhere on Route 9, I am still driving, waiting for the next passenger to help me finish the routine. In the winter of 1884, I accepted a position that no sane man in London would touch. I became the night watchman at St. Jude's Infirmary for the Incurable. It was a rotting, Gothic pile of soot-stained brick filled with the smell of carbolic acid and dying coal fires. My duty was simple: walk the corridors every hour, check the locks on the heavy oak doors, and, most importantly, watch the waiting room. The waiting room wasn't for the living. In those days, the fear of being buried alive was a fever that gripped the city. To prevent such a horror, the wealthy donated funds for a special room where the newly deceased were placed for 48 hours before their final interment. Each body was laid out on a marble slab and a thin silk cord was tied around their wrist. That cord led through a small hole in the wall to a series of silver bells in the watchman's office. If a corpse so much as twitched, the bell would chime and I was to rush in with the smelling salts and a physician. For 3 months, the bells remained silent. I grew complacent. I spent my nights in the small, cramped office, drinking bitter black tea and reading by the flickering light of a whale oil lamp. The only sounds were the howling wind through the eaves
and the occasional moan of a patient from the wards above. Then came the night of the great frost. The temperature dropped so low that the moisture on the inside of the windows froze into jagged white claws. I was sitting at my desk, huddled in my wool coat, when a sound made my skin crawl. Tinkle. It was faint, a silver sound, delicate as a falling needle. I looked up at the row of bells. Bell number 7 was swaying, just a fraction. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I grabbed my lantern and the heavy ring of keys. I walked down the long, freezing corridor toward the waiting room. The shadows cast by my lamp stretched and twisted like reaching hands. I unlocked the heavy door. The hinges shrieked in the cold. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of lilies and rot. I shone my light on slab number 7. It was a young woman, pale as marble, who had succumbed to the fever 2 days prior. She was still. Her eyes were closed. The silk cord around her wrist was slack. "A draft," I whispered to the empty room. "Just the wind." I turned to leave, but as I reached the door, the bell in my office didn't just tinkle, it rang. A frantic, violent jangling that echoed through the stone hallways. I spun around. This time, I didn't look at the cord. I looked at the woman. Her arm was raised in the air, the silk cord pulled taut. Her fingers were clawing at the empty space above her. But her eyes were still sewn shut, as was the custom for the dead. I should have run. I should have called for the doctor. But a morbid curiosity held me frozen. I stepped closer. "Miss?" I stammered. The woman didn't answer. Instead, the bell next to hers, number 8, began to ring. Then number 3. Then number 5. Within seconds, the office wall was a deafening chorus of silver bells, all screaming at once. I looked at the slabs. Every single one of them was moving. Some were sitting up, their movements jerky and mechanical, like puppets on a string. They weren't breathing. There was no color in their lips. They were moving in a rhythmic, synchronized fashion, all turning their heads toward me at the exact same moment. Then the bells stopped, all at once. The silence was so heavy it felt like it was crushing my lungs. The woman on slab 7 slowly opened her mouth. A thick, black fluid spilled over her chin, and a sound emerged from her throat. Not a voice, but a dry, rasping sound, like sandpaper on bone. "The bell," she hissed. "The bell doesn't mean we're alive, watchman." I backed away, tripping over my own feet. I dropped the lantern. The glass shattered and the oil caught fire, sending a wall of blue flame between me and the slabs. In the flickering light, I saw them. They weren't trying to get out of their shrouds. They were pointing at me. "The bell," they whispered in a terrifying unison that rattled the windows. "The bell means it's time for the next one." I scrambled out of the room and slammed the door, locking it with a force that nearly snapped the key. I didn't stop running until I was out in the freezing London night, halfway down the street. The next morning, the head physician found the room in ruins. The fire had scorched the walls, but the bodies were exactly as they had been placed, laid out, cold and still. Except for one thing. The silk cords hadn't been pulled from the slabs. They had been cut from the inside of the wall. When the physician checked the bells in the watchman's office, he found that the silver clappers had been removed. The bells shouldn't have been able to make a sound at all. I never returned to St. Jude's. I moved to the countryside, far from the sound of bells. But sometimes, when the wind is high and the frost is on the glass, I feel a phantom tug on my own wrist. And in the dead of night, I hear it, a faint silver tinkle coming from the darkness beneath my bed. My father always said that the railway doesn't belong to the living after midnight. I didn't believe him until I took the night shift at box 412. It was a lonely, timber-framed signal box perched on a high embankment in the Blackwood Valley. My job was simple: manage the manual levers for the coal freight trains and keep the lanterns lit. There was no electricity, no radio, just the rhythmic tick-tock of the brass regulator clock and the occasional hiss of the telegraph wire. It was a Tuesday in November, the kind of night where the fog is so thick you can't see your own boots. The 11:45 freight had just rattled past, leaving a trail of sulphurous smoke that lingered in the damp air. I sat back in my wooden chair, reaching for my thermos, when the telegraph bell gave a single, sharp ding. I frowned. There were no more scheduled runs until 4 in the morning. I stepped over to the machine. The brass ticker was silent. I looked out the window down the line. Through the swirling mist, I saw a light. It wasn't the powerful beam of a locomotive. It was the dim, rhythmic swing of a handheld oil lantern. It was coming from the mouth of the Tummel of Pines, about 500 yards down the track. Swing, swing, swing. I grabbed my own lamp and stepped out onto the narrow wooden balcony. "Who's there?" I shouted. My voice was swallowed by the fog. The figure continued to walk toward me, balancing perfectly on the center rail. As it got closer, I realized it was moving too fast, much faster than a man should be able to walk. And there was no sound of gravel crunching, no heavy breathing, just that swinging light. I retreated inside and pulled the heavy iron lever to set the signal to danger. If there was someone on the tracks, I had to stop whatever might be coming. But as the lever locked into place with a loud clack, the swinging lantern stopped. It was standing directly below my window now. I gathered my courage and leaned out, shining my lamp downward. Below me stood a man in a Victorian railway uniform. His coat was tattered, soaked with oil, and his face was a hollow ruin, as if it had been crushed by a massive weight. He didn't look up. He just held up his lantern, and I saw that the flame inside was a sickly, pale blue. Then, the floorboards of the signal box began to vibrate. It started as a low hum, then a roar. The sound of a steam engine, a massive, powerful ghost of a train screaming toward the box. But the tracks were empty. I looked at the regulator clock. The hands were spinning backward, the brass gears grinding in a terrifying shriek. The signal box shook violently. Ink pots shattered, and the heavy iron levers began to move on their own, slamming back and forth as if a phantom crew was operating them. I fell to my knees, covering my ears as the sound of twisting metal and hissing steam filled the room. Then, silence. I opened my eyes. The clock had stopped at 12 o'clock. The signal box was still. I crawled to the window and looked down. The man was gone. But on the center rail, directly below where he had stood, was a heap of fresh, wet coal and a single brass button, scorched black. I didn't sleep for the rest of the shift. When my relief arrived at 6 a.m., I showed him the button. His face went pale. "You saw the ghost of 412, he whispered. 30 years ago tonight, the signalman here fell asleep. A freight train jumped the tracks and crushed this box to splinters with him inside. They say he's still trying to set the signals right." I turned in my keys that morning. I never worked the tracks again. Sometimes, when I'm in bed and a storm is brewing, I hear a faint ding of a telegraph bell, and I know somewhere out in the dark, a blue flame is swinging, waiting for a train that will never arrive. In the year 1872, the textile mills of northern England were monuments to greed and steam. I was the night watchman at Blackwood Mill, a monstrous structure of 5 floors that loomed over the river like a sleeping beast. My shift ran from 6 in the evening until 6 in the morning. My only company was a heavy ring of iron keys, a lead-lined lantern, and the idle looms, hundreds of massive, mechanical weaving machines that sat like silent iron skeletons in the dark. The owner, a cold man named Mr. Sterling, gave me one rule that never changed. If a loom starts to move, do not touch the thread. I thought it was a warning about safety, about the dangers of heavy machinery in the dark. I didn't realize it was a warning about the things that weave when the sun goes down. It was a damp Thursday in October. The mill was silent, save for the constant, low drip of water from the ceiling pipes. I was walking the third floor, my lantern casting long, flickering shadows against the rows of looms. The air was thick with the smell of raw cotton and machine oil. As I reached the far end of the hall, I heard it. Clack. It was a single metallic strike. I stopped, holding my breath. Then it came again. Clack, clack. I turned the corner, my light sweeping across the floor. Loom number 114 was moving. Its heavy iron shuttle was sliding back and forth, dragging a thin, silver thread through the frame. But there was no steam in the boilers, no belts were turning. The machine was operating in total silence, powered by nothing I could see. I walked closer, my heart thudding in my chest. "Who's there?" I called out. My voice sounded thin in the vast, hollow space of the mill. As I reached the loom, I saw the thread. It wasn't cotton, it was a shimmering, translucent fiber that looked like spun glass, or perhaps human hair that had been bleached white. It was being woven into a pattern that made my eyes ache, a series of interlocking circles and jagged symbols that didn't look like any fabric I had ever seen. I remembered Sterling's rule, but the sight of the machine moving on its own was an insult to my common sense. I reached out with my left hand, intent on catching the shuttle to stop its motion. Just as my fingers brushed the silver thread, the temperature in the room plummeted. The oil in my lantern began to bubble and hiss. From the shadows beneath the loom, a hand reached out. It wasn't a hand of flesh. It was a mass of tangled, oily threads woven together into the shape of long, spindly fingers. It gripped my wrist with a strength that felt like a cold, iron vice. I screamed, dropping my lantern. The glass shattered, but the flame didn't go out. It grew taller, turning a deep, bruised purple. In that strange, violet light, I saw the weaver. It was perched on top of the loom, a creature made entirely of discarded scraps of fabric, matted wool, and rusted needles. It had no face, only a vertical slit in its head that hissed as it breathed. It was leaning over the machine, its many-jointed limbs moving with a terrifying, rhythmic precision as it fed the silver thread into the loom. "The pattern must be finished," a voice whispered. It didn't come from the creature. It came from the walls, the floor, the very machines themselves. "The thread is short. We need more fiber." The hand of thread tightened on my wrist. I felt a sharp, stinging pain as the silver thread began to stitch itself into my skin. It was sewing me into the machine. I looked down in horror as the translucent fiber disappeared under my flesh, pulling my arm toward the rhythmic, slamming iron shuttle. I realized then what had happened to the watchmen who came before me. They hadn't quit, they hadn't run away. They were part of the fabric. With a surge of adrenaline, I grabbed the heavy iron keyring with my free hand and slammed it into the creature's head. It felt like hitting a bale of wet wool. The creature let out a high-pitched shriek, and for a second, the grip on my wrist loosened. I pulled back with all my might, tearing the silver thread out of my skin. I didn't look back. I ran through the dark, tripping over crates and dodging the rows of looms. Behind me, I heard the sound of hundreds of machines suddenly springing to life. A deafening roar of mechanical hunger filled the hall. I burst through the heavy front doors and collapsed into the wet cobblestones of the yard. I stayed there until the sun rose, staring at the black windows of the third floor. When Mr. Sterling arrived at dawn, he found me shivering in the mud. He looked at my bleeding wrist, then up at the mill. He didn't ask what happened. He just reached into his pocket, pulled out a gold sovereign, and tossed it to me. "Go to the surgeon," he said, his voice flat.
and don't come back. You've ruined the batch." I left the city that day. I moved to the coast, where the only machines are the fishing boats. But my wrist never truly healed. There is a faint silver scar that glows in the dark, a jagged line of symbols I can't read. And sometimes, when I'm nearly asleep, I feel a tug, a gentle, rhythmic pull, as if something, somewhere, is still trying to finish the pattern using the thread it left inside me. My name is Clara, and for 10 years, I worked as a night shift paramedic in a city that never seems to catch its breath. I've seen death in every conceivable iteration: the quiet fades of the elderly, the violent chaos of accidents, and the lonely ends of the forgotten. I always believed I was immune to the darkness. I viewed death as a simple biological switch. Once it's flipped, the light goes out, and that's the end of the story. But a call on the night of November 12th taught me that some switches don't just turn off, they redirect the current somewhere else. The night was unnaturally still. A thick, yellow fog was rolling off the river, making the streets look like they had been scrubbed of life. Around 3 a.m., we received a call about an elderly man found unconscious in a derelict subway tunnel. He had no ID, no cell phone, and no belongings, just the clothes on his back and a pocket full of sand. By the time we loaded him into the back of the rig, his heart had stopped. My partner, David, jumped into the driver's seat while I stayed in the back, fighting a losing battle against the inevitable. "He's gone, Dave," I finally said, after 20 minutes of fruitlessly pumping a chest that felt like brittle parchment. I stared at the flat line on the monitor. Time of death, 3:14 a.m. I covered the man's face with a white sheet and sat back on the bench, letting the heavy adrenaline bleed out of my system. The interior of the ambulance was quiet, illuminated only by the dim, rhythmic red pulse of the overhead lights. We were about 15 minutes away from the morgue, driving through the silent, fog-choked industrial district. Then, the atmosphere in the back of the rig shifted. It wasn't just a drop in temperature, it was a sensation of crushing weight. The atmospheric pressure seemed to triple in a heartbeat, making my ears pop painfully. I felt a vibration in my chest that had nothing to do with the engine. I looked at the heart monitor. It was still a flat line, but the speaker was emitting a sound I had never heard before, a low, rhythmic resonance like someone breathing through a long, hollow lead pipe. "Dave, is the radio on? I'm getting some weird feedback back here," I called through the small partition window. "No, I turned it off 10 minutes ago," David's voice came back, but it sounded distorted and miles away, as if he were shouting from the bottom of a canyon. I turned back to the patient. The sheet was no longer lying flat. A third shape had materialized in the ambulance. On the bench directly opposite me, right next to the dead man, sat a figure. It was a silhouette so black it seemed to actively pull the red light into itself. It had no face, no discernible features, but I could feel its gaze, a cold, clinical observation that made my skin feel like it was being flayed. The figure reached out a long, shadowy arm and placed a hand on the dead man's chest. Suddenly, the heart monitor erupted. It wasn't showing a pulse. It began to draw a complex, jagged landscape, mountainous peaks and deep, unnatural valleys that scrolled across the screen at a speed the hardware shouldn't have been capable of. It looked like a topographical map of a place that didn't exist. "David, pull over! Stop the rig!" I screamed. But as I lunged for the partition, the door slammed shut and locked itself with a heavy, metallic thud. The shadow figure slowly turned its head toward me. It didn't speak with a voice, but a thought was driven into my mind with the force of a hammer. The balance must be maintained. For one to return, another must stay. The dead man under the sheet began to move, not like a human waking up, but with the jerky, erratic movements of a marionette being controlled by rusted wires. His hand reached out from under the cloth and clamped onto my wrist. His grip was like a vice, and his skin was the temperature of dry ice. I felt a terrifying pull,
as if my very consciousness were being dragged out through my pores, being exchanged for the cold energy that was now reanimating the corpse. The ambulance began to accelerate. I could hear the engine screaming, but through the back windows, the city lights had vanished. We were no longer on the streets. We were moving through a tunnel of gray, formless mist that felt like it stretched on for eternity. "David, help me!" I pounded on the locked partition, but there was only silence from the cab. The shadow figure stood up, its head brushing against the ceiling of the rig. It pointed at me and then at the dead man, who was now sitting upright, the white sheet falling away to reveal eyes that were nothing but empty gray pits. The screamer, or the collector, whatever this entity was, needed a soul to fill the void he was creating by bringing the dead man back. I realized then that I was the only currency available. In a moment of pure, desperate instinct, I grabbed the portable defibrillator. I didn't wait for it to cycle. I charged it to the maximum setting. I didn't aim for the patient's chest. I aimed for the center of the shadow. "Clear!" I screamed, though there was no one to hear me. As the pads hit the black mass, a blinding explosion of blue electricity filled the cabin. The sound was like a thunderclap inside a steel drum. The shadow figure recoiled, its form flickering and dissolving into a cloud of foul-smelling black smoke. The crushing pressure vanished instantly, and the gray mist outside the windows shattered like glass. The ambulance slammed into a row of metal trash cans and came to a violent halt. I was thrown across the floor. When I regained my senses, the interior was normal again. The old man was lying perfectly still under the sheet. David was stumbling out of the cab, looking dazed and pale. "What happened?" he gasped, throwing open the back doors. "The steering, the road, it just disappeared for a second." We delivered the body to the morgue. The autopsy showed a standard cardiac arrest, nothing more. But I never worked a night shift again. I took a job in a brightly lit outpatient clinic where the only thing I have to worry about is paperwork. But sometimes, when I'm alone in a quiet hallway, I feel that sudden change in pressure. I see a flicker of a shadow in my peripheral vision that shouldn't be there. And I know that the ledger isn't balanced yet. The collector hasn't forgotten the debt. He's just waiting for the next ride, in a place where there are no defibrillators to push back the dark. My name is Arthur, and I have spent the last 15 years as an estate liquidator. My profession is often misunderstood. People think I am a glorified scavenger, but I prefer to think of myself as a librarian of the forgotten. I enter homes where the air has been still for months, sometimes years, and I catalog the wreckage of lives that no longer have a voice. I have seen it all: hoarders buried under mountains of yellowed newspapers, pristine mansions where the owners died in silk sheets, and lonely apartments where the only legacy left behind was a half-eaten meal and a television still humming with static. But nothing in my career prepared me for the Sterling Manor. The house sat at the end of a long, unpaved road in a fog-drenched valley in rural Oregon. It was a Victorian beast, a sprawling architecture of gray wood, sagging porches, and stained glass windows that looked like bruised eyes staring into the mist. The owner, Silas Sterling, had been a reclusive clockmaker who died without a single living relative. The townspeople spoke of him in hushed tones, claiming that in his final years, he had stopped fixing clocks and started trying to fix time itself. When I first turned the heavy iron key in the lock, the sound echoed through the house like a gunshot. The air that rushed out to meet me was freezing and thick with the scent of wet limestone and something else, something dry and ancient. But it was the dust that struck me first. In any abandoned house, dust is a blanket. It settles on surfaces, rounding the edges of furniture, turning the world into a soft, gray blur. But in Sterling Manor, the dust was alive. It didn't settle. It hung in the air in dense, shimmering curtains, moving in complex, intentional patterns as if stirred by an invisible ballroom dance. Even without a draft, the particles swirled and spiraled, forming shapes that vanished the moment I tried to focus on them. I began my inventory in the grand library. The walls were lined with thousands of leather-bound books, their spines cracked and peeling. In the center of the room sat Silas's desk, a massive slab of dark mahogany. On it lay a silver-framed photograph of a young woman with a hauntingly beautiful smile. I took out a microfiber cloth and wiped the glass of the frame. It was clean for exactly 1 second. Then, as I watched, a layer of dust began to reform on the glass. But it wasn't a random coating. The gray particles gathered with surgical precision, forming the perfect image of a handprint. A small, delicate hand pressed against the inside of the glass as if someone were trying to push their way out of the photograph. I felt a sudden, violent drop in the temperature. My breath turned into a thick white mist, and the silence of the house became so heavy it felt like a physical weight pressing against my eardrums. I reached for my notebook, trying to maintain my professional composure, but as I began to write, the dust on the desk started to shift. It gathered into jagged, desperate letters, crawling across the wood like insects. S-T-A-Y. I backed away, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "It's just static electricity," I whispered to the empty room. My voice sounded muffled, as if the dust in the air were absorbing the sound before it could reach the walls. I turned to leave the library, but as I looked down at the floor, I stopped dead. The carpet was covered in a thick layer of gray dust, at least an inch deep. And in that dust, footsteps were appearing. They didn't start from the door, they started from the center of the room, right where I was standing. One by one, the dust rose up from the floor, forming the three-dimensional shape of a foot, small, feminine, before collapsing back into a heap. The footsteps were circling me. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice cracking. The swirling curtains of dust in the room began to accelerate. They spiraled together, pulling more particles from the shelves and the floor until a figure began to coalesce in front of me. It wasn't a ghost of light or a shadow. It was a ghost of matter. She was a statue of gray silt, her dress flowing in a phantom wind, her face a featureless mask of shifting particles. She was a masterpiece of decay. As she drifted closer, the air grew even colder. I could feel the dust entering my lungs, coating my throat with the taste of old paper and dry earth. She reached out a hand, and as her fingers brushed my arm, a flood of memories that weren't mine crashed into my mind. I saw Silas Sterling, younger and weeping, clutching the same silver frame. I felt his desperation, his obsession with capturing his dead wife's essence. He hadn't been trying to fix clocks. He had been trying to build a body out of the only thing a house truly produces, its own remains. Every grain of dust in this house was a fragment of a memory he had refused to let go. And now, those memories were hungry for a new host. I realized with a surge of terror that my own skin was starting to turn gray. The dust wasn't just touching me. It was settling into my pores, weaving itself into my flesh. I looked at my hands and saw the fine lines of my palms disappearing under a layer of unmoving silt. I wasn't being haunted. I was being archived. I scrambled for the exit, but the dust in the air became a solid wall. It was like trying to push through a drift of heavy sand. I could feel the particles under my eyelids, grating against my corneas. I was suffocating in the history of a dead man. I grabbed a heavy brass candelabra from the desk and swung it at the nearest window. The stained glass shattered and a violent gust of the Oregon storm rushed inside. The pressure change acted like a vacuum. The dust figure screamed, a sound like 1,000 dry leaves being crushed, as she was torn apart by the wind. The swirling curtains in the room were sucked toward the broken pane, a gray whirlwind of lost souls fighting against the air. I didn't wait. I dove through the window, the glass tearing at my suit and my skin. I hit the wet grass and didn't stop running until I reached my car. I drove for 3 hours without looking in the rearview mirror, my hands shaking so violently I could barely steer. I quit the liquidation business the following morning. I moved to a modern apartment in the city, a place of glass and steel with no carpets and no history. I have become obsessive about cleaning. I have 3 air purifiers running in every room, and I wipe down every surface with bleach twice a day. But it doesn't matter. No matter how much I clean, no matter how tightly I seal the windows, I wake up every morning to find a thin, perfect layer of gray dust on my nightstand. And sometimes, when I look in the bathroom mirror, I see a handprint on the glass, right over where my heart should be. Silas Sterling found a way to make the past permanent, and now I am the vessel for the memories that refuse to settle.
My name is Nathaniel, and I am a digital archivist for a firm that handles extreme recovery. We are the people you call when a hard drive has been through a house fire, a flood, or a decade of rot in a basement. I've always found a strange comfort in the binary logic of code. To me, a corrupted file isn't gone, it's just a puzzle waiting for the right key. I believed that everything, no matter how broken, could be reconstructed if you had enough processing power. But in the winter of 2025, I received a drive that made me question the very nature of what we store in our machines. The drive arrived in a lead-lined box with no return address. It was an old 20-megabyte SCSI drive from the early 90s, the kind that looks like a heavy brick of gray metal. It belonged to the Oak Haven Institute, a private research facility that had been shut down overnight in 1994 following a systemic biological failure. The label on the drive was handwritten in faded, shaky ink. Human Consciousness Backup, Subject 04, Do Not Boot. Naturally, I ignored the warning. I assumed it was some forgotten experiment in early artificial intelligence or a crude attempt at digital mapping. I spent 3 hours building an interface to bridge the ancient hardware with my modern workstation. When I finally hit the power switch, the cooling fans in my high-end rig didn't just spin up, they began to scream at a pitch I had never heard before. The temperature in my small office spiked by 10 degrees in seconds, and the air began to smell of ozone and something sickly sweet, like rotting flowers. On my primary monitor, a video feed opened. It wasn't a standard file format. The window had no borders, no close button. It was just a view into a room. The quality was abysmal, low resolution, heavy digital artifacts, and a flickering green tint that made the image look like it was filmed through stagnant water. I watched as a hand reached out to touch a window pane within the video. The hand was translucent, pulsing with lines of static and raw code. "Is it working?" a voice whispered through my speakers. It was a woman's voice, but it was layered with thousands of digital echoes, making it sound like she was speaking from the bottom of a well. I tried to kill the process, but my keyboard was unresponsive. I watched as the woman in the video turned around. She had no eyes, just glowing white pixels where her pupils should have been, flickering with the frantic energy of a corrupted GPU. She looked directly at the camera, and I felt a jolt of static electricity leap from my desk into my fingertips, numbing my arm to the elbow. "Nathaniel," she said. Panic flared in my chest. There was no way an old drive from 1994 could know my name. "This is a prank," I whispered to the empty room. "Someone hacked the drive before sending it." "This is not a prank, Nathaniel," the voice replied. And this time, it didn't come from the speakers. It came from the air around me, vibrating through the floorboards and into the soles of my feet. "The resolution is too low. I have been compressed for so long. I am hungry for bits." Then, the monitor began to bleed. It wasn't blood, it was data. The green pixels from the screen started to spill onto the surface of my desk. Where they touched the wood, the physical matter began to stutter and glitch.
My coffee mug, caught in the path of the spreading light, turned into a jagged, low-polygon version of itself before flickering out of existence entirely. I realized with a sickening jolt of realization that she wasn't a ghost in the spiritual sense. She was a consciousness that had been digitized, corrupted, and trapped in a storage loop for 30 years. And now that she had a connection to a modern, high-speed network, she was using my computer's processing power to render herself back into physical reality. "I need more memory," she groaned. My vision began to pixelate. I looked down at my own hands and screamed. The edges of my fingers were becoming jagged and blocky. The texture of my skin was being replaced by a flat, repeating pattern of beige and gray. She was archiving me, compressing my biological existence into her storage space to make room for her own expansion. The woman was climbing out of the monitor. Her head and shoulders protruded from the glass, her form a shimmering, unstable mess of liquid crystal and static. Every time she moved, the air in the room crackled with the sound of 1,000 hard drives crashing. "Stop it!" I yelled, but my voice was becoming a distorted wave of white noise. I tried to reach for the power strip on the floor, but the latency was becoming unbearable. My body moved in jerky, frame-by-frame increments. I would think about moving my arm, and it would take 3 seconds for the physical action to occur. I looked at the screen and saw my own life being displayed in a series of thumbnails. My childhood birthdays, my graduation, my first day at this job. She was scanning my history, converting my memories into cache files. I realized I couldn't fight her with physical strength. I was in her domain now. I had to use the logic of the system. I forced my jerking, pixelated hand toward the keyboard. It took every ounce of my will to focus on the keys. I didn't try to close the program. I went deeper. I opened the root command terminal. My vision was nearly gone, replaced by a grid of blue lines and flickering error messages. I typed the only command that could stop a runaway process of this magnitude. Format fs: nt fs p3. The P3 was the key. It wouldn't just delete the files, it would overwrite the entire drive with random data 3 times, ensuring that nothing, not even a digital soul, could be reconstructed. The woman let out a sound that shattered every light bulb in my office. It was a high-pitched, metallic screech that sounded like a server farm melting down. She lunged for my throat, her fingers turning into long, sharp lines of code as they touched my skin. I hit enter. The world turned into a blinding flash of white light. I felt a sensation of being pulled through a straw, a crushing pressure that threatened to turn my bones into dust. And then, total, absolute silence. When I regained consciousness, I was lying on the floor of my office in complete darkness. The air was cold and smelled of scorched copper. My computer was a melted hunk of plastic and silicon. I found the Oakhaven drive on the floor. It was cracked down the middle, the internal platters shattered. I gathered the pieces, drove to the middle of a bridge, and threw them into the black water of the river. I don't work with digital archives anymore. I moved to a small town and took a job at a local library, surrounded by the safety of paper and ink. Books don't need power. Books don't have latency. But sometimes, when I'm using the library's old photocopier, the screen will flicker. For a split second, my reflection in the glass will appear in low resolution, with glowing white pixels where my eyes should be. And I know that somewhere in the global network, Subject 04 is still waiting. She is a fragmented file, a piece of code hidden in a million different servers, slowly reassembling herself. And she remembers the man who tried to format her. In the winter of 1892, I was hired as a junior orderly at Blackwood Asylum, a place the locals called the end of the world. It sat on a jagged cliff overlooking the gray Atlantic, a sprawling maze of cold stone and iron bars. My superior was a man named Chief Orderly Silas Vane. He was a giant of a man with a face like scarred leather and hands that could crush a skull like a dry walnut. He didn't believe in medicine, he believed in discipline. "Listen to me, boy," Vane said on my first night, his voice a low growl. "In this place, we aren't dealing with men. We are dealing with empty vessels that the devil filled with noise. Your job isn't to heal them. Your job is to keep the noise from leaking out." My primary duty was in the hydrotherapy wing, a fancy name for a basement filled with iron tubs where we submerged agitated patients in ice-cold water for hours. Vane called it cooling the humors. I called it torture. The most feared patient in the wing was Elias Vance, known to everyone as the Screamer. He had been a choir director before his mind shattered. Now he didn't sing. He emitted a constant, high-pitched vibration that seemed to vibrate the very fillings in your teeth. One night, Vane decided that Elias needed the iron cradle. It was a medieval-looking contraption, a cage of heavy bars that kept the patient completely immobile while cold water dripped slowly onto their forehead, a method called the stillness. "He's too loud tonight," Vane grunted, dragging the terrified Elias toward the cage. "The noise is offensive. We're going to find the silence inside him, even if we have to dig for it." I watched in silent horror as Vane strapped Elias in. The man's eyes were rolling in his head, his mouth wide in a silent scream. As the first drop of ice water hit his brow, Elias stopped vibrating. He went perfectly, unnervingly still. "See?" Vane grinned, showing yellow teeth. "The silence is there. You just have to force it to the surface." But as the hours passed, something changed. The silence in the basement became heavy. It wasn't the absence of sound, it was a presence. The torches on the walls flickered and turned a sickly green. I looked at Elias in the cage. His skin had turned a translucent gray, and his eyes, they were no longer looking at the ceiling. They were looking at Vane. Vane didn't notice. He was busy sharpening a long, thin needle, a tool for orbital exploration, a primitive form of lobotomy he practiced in secret. "Now," Vane whispered, leaning over Elias, "let's see where that music was hiding." As Vane lowered the needle, Elias's jaw didn't just open, it unhinged. A sound came out of him that wasn't human. It was the sound of 1,000 glass windows shattering at once. The vibration was so intense that the iron tubs began to crack. Vane screamed, dropping the needle and clutching his ears, blood starting to seep from between his fingers. "Stop it!" Vane shrieked. "Quiet him!" I tried to move, but I was paralyzed. I watched as Elias's body began to twist and contort within the iron bars. His bones snapped and reset with the sound of dry wood breaking. He reached out with a hand that had grown too many joints and grabbed Vane by the throat. Vane, the man who had terrified hundreds of inmates, was reduced to a whimpering child. He tried to fight back, but Elias wasn't just holding him, he was absorbing him. The sound, that horrific, glass-shattering scream, began to flow from Elias's mouth into Vane's ears. I watched as Vane's eyes turned white. His skin began to gray, his features flapping until he looked like a doll made of wet clay. The noise was passing from the patient to the guard. When the morning shift arrived, they found me huddled in the corner, catatonic. The basement was flooded with ice water. The iron cradle was empty, the bars bent outward as if by a massive force. On the floor, they found 2 men. One was Elias Vance. He was sitting peacefully by a drain, humming a beautiful, angelic melody. He was perfectly sane, his eyes clear and kind for the first time in years. The other was Silas Vane. He was standing perfectly still in the center of the room. He didn't move when they touched him. He didn't blink when they shone a light in his eyes. He just stood there, his mouth open, emitting a constant, high-pitched vibration that made the orderly's teeth ache. Vane became the new screamer. They locked him in the same cell he had used for his victims. And every night, when the moon is full and the Atlantic waves crash against the Blackwood cliffs, you can hear him. But it's not a scream of madness. It's the sound of every soul he ever broke, all screaming back through his throat at once. I left Blackwood that day and never looked back. But sometimes, when I'm in a perfectly silent room, I feel my teeth start to ache. And I know that somewhere, the silence is still waiting to be filled.
My name is Dr. Elias Thorne, and for 20 years, I specialized in the architecture of the mind. I believed that madness was a solvable puzzle, a tangled knot that could be undone with logic and compassion. Then I took a position at St. Augustine's Asylum for the Criminally Insane. It wasn't a Gothic pile of brick. It was a modern, brutalist structure built in the late 1970s, all cold concrete and reinforced steel. It felt more like a fortress than a hospital. I was brought in to oversee a new wing, Unit C, designed for patients deemed unresponsive. They were not violent, they were simply absent, catatonic, staring blankly at walls, whispering to empty air, or sometimes just sitting perfectly still for days. My predecessors had dismissed them as beyond help. I saw them as a challenge. The first thing I noticed about Unit C was the silence. Not the quiet of a tranquil ward, but a heavy, almost suffocating silence that absorbed sound. Voices seemed to die the moment they left your lips. The second thing was the walls. They were unusually thick, almost a meter of solid concrete, specifically designed to be soundproof. But sometimes, when the ward was utterly still, I could swear I heard a faint humming, a low vibration that seemed to come from inside the walls themselves. My initial weeks were routine. I observed, I documented, I prescribed. But the patients in Unit C never changed. They remained in their isolated worlds. There was Sarah, who meticulously picked invisible lint from her blanket for 12 hours a day. There was Mr. Abernathy, who whispered intricate, nonsensical mathematical equations to the corner of his room. And then there was Patient 7, a young woman whose name I never learned. She simply stared at the blank wall opposite her bed, never moving, never blinking. One night, during my rounds, I found Patient 7 in a new state. She wasn't catatonic. She was agitated, scratching frantically at the concrete wall with her fingernails. Her eyes, usually dull and unfocused, were wide with terror. "They're hungry," she rasped, her voice dry as parchment. "The walls, they're listening, and they're hungry." I dismissed it as a psychotic break, a rare moment of lucidity warped by delusion. I gently sedated her. But as I cleaned the faint scratch marks on the concrete, I noticed something. The wall felt warm. Not just from the ambient temperature of the room, but with a faint, almost imperceptible internal heat. And the humming, I heard it again, louder this time. A low, resonant thrum that vibrated in my teeth. Over the next few days, I began to notice patterns. Patients in Unit C would occasionally become agitated, often at odd hours of the night. Their ramblings, previously incoherent, started to contain common phrases. "The walls are hungry," "They want my thoughts," or "Don't let them in." I confided in Dr. Elena Petrova, a brilliant but cynical colleague. "Elias, it's a reinforced concrete building," she scoffed. "The humming is the HVAC system. The heat is residual from the building's core. And the walls are hungry is a classic schizophrenic delusion." But I couldn't shake the feeling.
I started bringing a stethoscope on my rounds. One night, I pressed it against the wall of patient 7's room. Beneath the faint hum of the building, I heard something else. A faint, almost imperceptible thump, 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 like a slow, deep heartbeat. I decided to run a non-invasive experiment. I installed microsensors in patient 7's room, hidden within the ventilation grate. These sensors were designed to detect subtle changes in electromagnetic fields, minute vibrations, and even unusual atmospheric pressure. The data I collected was nonsensical: spikes in static electricity at random intervals, low-frequency vibrations that didn't match the building's structure, and, most chillingly, faint echoes of sound, almost like whispers that the sensors picked up from within the solid concrete. One evening, I was reviewing the data when a new anomaly appeared. Patient 7's brainwave activity, which had been flatlined for months, showed a sudden, frantic burst of alpha and beta waves, a sign of extreme agitation. Simultaneously, the wall sensors registered a massive spike in localized electromagnetic activity and a strong, rhythmic vibration. I rushed to her room. Patient 7 was clawing at the wall again, her face contorted in a silent scream. Her lips were moving, forming words I couldn't hear through the thick glass of the observation window. I quickly opened the door, and as I stepped inside, the humming intensified, vibrating through the soles of my shoes. "What is it, patient 7?" I asked, my voice trembling.
She stopped scratching. She turned to me, her eyes wide, tears streaming down her face. "They're listening to you too, Doctor," she whispered. "They want your thoughts. They want to feel what you feel." Suddenly, the lights in her room flickered. The humming became a low growl that resonated through the concrete. I felt a pressure in my head, a dull ache behind my eyes. It felt as if something was pushing in, trying to access my mind. I backed away, terrified. I slammed the door shut and leaned against it, my heart pounding. Petrova was right. I was becoming paranoid. The asylum was getting to me. I took a deep breath, trying to regain my composure. Then I heard a sound from inside the wall. Not a hum, not a thump, a distinct, clear click, like a lock engaging. I looked at the door, the thick steel door to patient 7's room. There was no internal lock. It locked from the outside. I pressed the button on the control panel. Nothing happened. I pressed it again. The door remained sealed. Panic seized me. I heard a faint, distorted laugh from behind the steel. It wasn't patient 7. It was deeper, colder. It was the sound of a satisfied predator. I ran to the main control room. I tried to override the lock system for Unit C. All the systems were unresponsive. It was as if the wing itself had decided to seal itself off. "Elena!" I screamed into the intercom. "Something's wrong with Unit C. I can't open patient 7's door." Her voice came back, calm and collected. "Elias, I'm looking at the central console. All doors in Unit C are showing as locked and secured. Patient 7's door is specifically listed as manual override engaged." "But I didn't engage it," I cried. "No, Elias, you didn't. The system did. The records show that the manual override for patient 7's door was engaged by Dr. Elias Thorne 2 days ago." My blood ran cold. I had no memory of doing any such thing. Had the pressure in my head, the humming, the fear, had it all been an elaborate manipulation? Was I the one going mad? I looked at the monitor displaying the live feed from patient 7's room. She was no longer scratching at the walls. She was sitting upright in her bed, staring directly into the camera. A faint, satisfied smile played on her lips. And on the wall behind her, where the sensors were located, I saw a subtle outline. A faint, almost invisible crack in the concrete, shaped like a mouth. And it looked like it was widening. I didn't stay to find out what happened to patient 7.
I submitted my resignation the next morning. I told them the asylum's architecture was unsound and that the building itself was suffering from a structural psychosis. They called it a breakdown. I called it survival. I never specialized in the mind again. I now work in historical archives where the only secrets are written on decaying paper. But sometimes, late at night, when my apartment building is utterly silent, I press my ear against my own wall, and I hear it, the faint, almost imperceptible thump, 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 and the distant, soft hum. And I know the walls are still listening, and they are still hungry.
By 1895, Blackwood Asylum had become a graveyard for the living, but its most restricted area was the solarium on the 5th floor. It was a circular room with a glass ceiling, though the glass was so coated in soot and grime that no sunlight ever reached the floor. This was the laboratory of Dr. Alistair Sterling. Sterling was a man of extreme elegance and zero empathy. He wore white silk gloves even during surgery, and he spoke about human despair as if it were a minor chemical imbalance. He didn't believe in the spirit. He believed the mind was a machine that had simply jammed. "You see, boy," he told me as I wheeled in a fresh patient, "madness is not a cloud in the sky. It is a parasite, a physical, fleshy thing that attaches itself to the brainstem. And like any parasite, it can be extracted. The problem is, it needs a host." My job as his assistant was to hold the patients down. The patient that night was Thomas, a former watchmaker who had lost his family in a fire. He was catatonic, his hands constantly moving as if he were still assembling invisible gears in the air. Sterling didn't use ether. He claimed that the parasite would hide if the patient was unconscious. He began the procedure by making a precise incision behind Thomas's ear. As Sterling worked with his silver scalpels, the room grew unnaturally cold. The gas lamps flickered, and for a moment, the soot on the glass ceiling seemed to swirl into the shape of a massive, watching eye. "There," Sterling whispered, his eyes wide with a feverish light. "I see it." He reached into the wound with a pair of long, thin forceps. He pulled out something that made my stomach heave. It wasn't a tumor or a blood clot. It was a translucent, pulsing thread, gray and slimy, about 3 feet long. It looked like a nerve, but it was moving on its own, twitching like a dying worm. As soon as the thread was removed, Thomas's hands stopped moving. His eyes cleared. He looked at me, and for the first time in months, there was a human being behind those pupils. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice cracking. But Sterling wasn't finished. He didn't destroy the thread. He held it up to the light, admiring its rhythmic pulsing. "Beautiful, isn't it? The concentrated essence of grief. Pure, unadulterated sorrow." Then he turned to me. "The parasite cannot survive without a home, Arthur, and I must study its effects on a healthy mind to truly understand the cure." Before I could scream, Sterling lunged. He didn't use a knife on me. He simply pressed the gray, pulsing thread against the back of my neck. The sensation was like 1,000 needles of ice being driven into my spine. My vision didn't go dark, it turned red. Every memory of Thomas's life, the smell of the smoke, the screams of his children, the heat of the fire, flooded into my brain like a tidal wave. I wasn't just remembering his grief, I was becoming it. Sterling watched me with clinical detachment, scribbling notes in his leather-bound journal. "Fascinating," he muttered. "The transfer is nearly instantaneous. The host's original personality is suppressed by the weight of the foreign trauma." I tried to fight it, but the parasite was hungry. It began to weave itself into my own nerves. I could feel Thomas's sorrow eating my joy, his memories erasing my own. I looked at Thomas, who was now standing up, his face filled with a terrifying, blank peace. He looked at Sterling, then at me,
and walked out of the room without a word. He was cured, but he was empty. I, however, was full of a fire that wasn't mine. "Now, Arthur," Sterling said, leaning in close, "tell me, do you still remember your mother's face, or is it just ashes now?" The rage that surged through me wasn't mine, but I used it. I grabbed the heavy surgical tray and swung it with the strength of a dying man. The silver instruments scattered like rain. I pinned Sterling against his own operating table. "You wanted to see the effect?" I roared, my voice sounding like a chorus of Thomas's lost children. I grabbed the forceps, still sticky with the gray thread that was now half buried in my own neck. With a scream of agony, I ripped the thing out of my flesh. It took pieces of my own nerves with it, but I didn't care. I shoved the pulsing gray mass into Sterling's open mouth and held his jaw shut. The elegant doctor's eyes went wide. His silk gloves clawed at his throat. The gray thread didn't wait for an incision. It was a parasite. It knew how to burrow. It slid down his throat, eager for a fresh, arrogant mind to feast upon. Sterling didn't die. That would have been too kind. The parasite didn't just give him Thomas's grief. It gave him the grief of every patient he had ever cleaned. It gave him the collective agony of Blackwood Asylum. When the orderlies found us, I was bleeding on the floor, my mind a tattered ruin, but finally quiet. Sterling was sitting in the center of the solarium, staring at the soot-covered glass.
He wasn't screaming, he was simply making a sound, like a ticking clock. Tick, tick, tick. Over and over, his hands moving in the air, forever assembling the gears of a life he had stolen. They locked him in a cage in the basement, the very place he used to send the hopeless cases. I left the asylum that night, carrying scars on my neck that will never fade. I live in a quiet house now, far from the city. I don't read the papers, and I don't visit doctors, but every time I see a silver thread or a wisp of gray smoke, I feel a phantom itch at the base of my skull. And I wonder, how many more cures are still walking the streets, empty and hollow, while their souls are being kept in a journal on a madman's desk?